The 22nd of June, 1941, approximately 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, 700,000 horses. The largest land invasion in the history of warfare, launched against a country with the largest army in the world. Joseph Stalin, who ran one of the most comprehensive surveillance states ever devised, was apparently surprised. This requires some explanation. To understand why Stalin trusted Hitler, you first have to understand that he didn't. Not exactly. What he trusted was his own analysis of the situation, an analysis that turned out to be wrong in ways that would cost the Soviet Union somewhere between 27 and 30 million lives. The two men were, on paper, ideological enemies of the most committed kind. Hitler had written, at considerable length, his intention to destroy Bolshevism and seize living space in the East. The Soviet Union was explicitly named. The reasoning was spelled out in some detail. Mein Kampf was not a subtle document. Stalin had read it. Soviet intelligence had read it. The entire Soviet foreign ministry had read it. This information was not hard to obtain. The book was widely available throughout Europe and had sold several million copies. This created a fairly obvious problem. Stalin resolved it by deciding that Hitler probably didn't mean it literally, or at least not yet, or at least not while other options remained available. This was, in retrospect, an error. 1933 saw the Nazis take power in Germany. For the next several years, Soviet foreign policy operated on the reasonable assumption that Germany represented an existential threat. The Soviets approached Britain and France repeatedly about collective security arrangements, a formal alliance to contain German expansion before it became unmanageable. Britain and France were not particularly interested. By 1938, they had demonstrated this quite clearly at Munich, where they handed Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial demands. The promise lasted about 6 months. In March of 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France issued a guarantee to Poland and began, rather belatedly, to consider the question of what they were actually going to do if Germany kept going. The answer, when it was eventually required, turned out to be declare war, then struggle considerably. Stalin drew a conclusion from all of this, which was that Britain and France would cheerfully allow Germany to expand eastward if it meant Germany left them alone. This was, broadly speaking, accurate. He drew a second conclusion, which was that the Soviet Union could not rely on Western guarantees and needed a different arrangement entirely. This led, on the 23rd of August, 1939, to one of the more remarkable diplomatic documents of the 20th century, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Two countries publicly committed to each other's destruction signed the non-aggression agreement, divided Eastern Europe between them in a secret protocol, and shook hands in Moscow while the rest of the world stared. Germany got a free hand in the West. The Soviet Union absorbed the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and most of Romania. Stalin considered this a considerable achievement. He had bought time. While Germany exhausted itself fighting Britain and France in the West, the Red Army would rearm, reorganize, and prepare. By the time Germany turned east, if it turned east, the Red Army would be ready. The plan had a certain logic to it. It also assumed France would not collapse in 6 weeks. France collapsed in 6 weeks. By the summer of 1940, Germany controlled most of Western Europe. Britain was surviving, narrowly, on the strength of its air force and 22 miles of English Channel. The long attritional war Stalin had been counting on had failed to materialize entirely. His entire timeline had been disrupted. This was inconvenient for several reasons. The Red Army was midway through a significant reorganization, partly necessitated by the fact that Stalin had spent the late 1930s executing approximately 35,000 of its senior officers during the Great Purge, 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders. This had created some certain command and control difficulties that were proving slow to resolve. The winter war with Finland, which had been expected to last 2 weeks, had lasted 3 months, cost around 125,000 Soviet lives, and demonstrated to any interested observer that the Red Army had problems that went considerably deeper than personnel. Stalin needed more time. He believed he would get it. Between late 1940 and June June 1941, Soviet intelligence received approximately 84 separate warnings that Germany was planning to invade. The warnings came from British intelligence, which had broken the Enigma cipher and could read Luftwaffe deployment orders. They came from Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy operating under journalistic cover in Tokyo, who had obtained the specific invasion date from his sources inside the German embassy. They came from Soviet agents embedded inside Germany itself. They came from defecting German soldiers who simply walked across the border and explained in some detail what was coming. And they came from the fairly self-evident fact that Germany had spent the preceding months moving 3 million troops, 3,000 tanks, and supporting infrastructure to the Soviet frontier. Stalin dismissed it all. His reasoning ran as follows. Britain was attempting to drag the Soviet Union into the war on the Allied side. Therefore, British intelligence was disinformation, designed to provoke a Soviet mobilization that would give Germany a pretext to attack. German defectors were provocateurs. The troop movements were maneuvers, or possibly an elaborate negotiating tactic. Germany would not invade because it could not sustain a two-front war, and Hitler, whatever his other qualities, was not strategically irrational. Some of this was not entirely without foundation. Hitler was, within certain parameters, operating rationally. The problem was that those parameters included a strategic assessment that Germany could defeat the Soviet Union in approximately 10 to 12 weeks, before American entry became decisive. Hitler concluded this was probable. He was wrong. But that determination would only become clear later. By May of 1941, the warnings became considerably harder to ignore. German reconnaissance aircraft were crossing into Soviet territory daily. Luftwaffe crews who crashed inside the border were being quietly returned without incident, which is itself a form of information. German diplomatic families were departing Moscow. German commercial shipments of goods the Soviets had already paid for stopped arriving. When intelligence officers presented Stalin with direct evidence of the invasion timetable, he reportedly annotated one report with instructions that the source, a German officer who had crossed the border specifically to provide the warning, apparently out of political conscience, should be sent to a certain location. A Russian bureaucratic euphemism for somewhere cold and extremely remote. The officer was arrested. He was shot the following year. At 3:15 in the morning of the 22nd of June, 1941, German forces crossed the border along the entire front simultaneously. By noon, the Luftwaffe had destroyed approximately 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground, lined up in neat rows, having not been dispersed despite repeated warnings. By the end of the first week, German armored columns had advanced 300 miles, encircled entire Soviet armies, and taken more prisoners than any previous campaign in the war. By December, Germany had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow, and the Soviet Union had suffered approximately 4.5 million casualties. For several days after the invasion began, Stalin was, in the clinical sense, non-functional. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow. He did not broadcast to the nation. He issued no coherent orders. Members of the Politburo who came to find him reportedly found him sitting in a chair in a darkened room. He reportedly assumed they had come to arrest him. They had not. They needed him to run the war. He recovered. He gave a radio address. He organized the defense. He proved over the years that followed to be a grimly effective wartime leader. The Soviet Union absorbed the invasion, held at the gates of Moscow, ground Germany down across a 4,000-mile front, and eventually pushed all the way to Berlin, none of which changes what happened in June 1941. The question of why Stalin failed to act on 84 warnings doesn't have one clean answer. Part of it was ideology. He had constructed an analytical framework in which British intelligence was automatically suspect. Evidence that did not fit the framework was reinterpreted until it did. Part of it was the purges. The senior officers who might have pushed back forcefully, men with the standing to tell Stalin directly that his assessment was catastrophically wrong, were dead. Those who remained watched their predecessors die and drew the appropriate conclusions about candor. Part of it was the system itself. Stalin had spent 2 decades in a political environment where delivering bad news was personally dangerous. His intelligence apparatus had learned thoroughly to tell him what he wanted to hear. The mechanisms for honest institutional assessment had been dismantled by the same man who now needed them most urgently. And part of it was simply that Stalin had decided Germany would not invade in 1941. Having decided this, he could not easily undecide it. The cost of being wrong, of having misread the situation so completely, of having signed the pact, of having trusted the timeline, was perhaps too large to absorb while it was still possible to do something about it. He absorbed it anyway, somewhat later than was useful. The Soviet Union lost somewhere between 27 and 30 million people in the Second World War. Germany lost the war. Stalin died in his bed in 1953, which is, by any measure, a better outcome than he had any particular right to expect. The 84 warnings remain, in the history of intelligence failures, something of a record.